Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well. It's a beautiful fall day where I am, a little bit of a drizzle, but I think it's kind of nice. Nice to have weather. Okay, very quick announcement, first of all, about this live transcription thing. It seems it's a little bit more complicated than I thought it would be. I have to request it from the Zoom company. It's not something they normally do. So it's going to take and we're not going to get it today, unfortunately, and I apologize for that. But hopefully by Tuesday, certainly they should okay it. It's not something that I can automatically turn on. They actually have to enable it, and it has to be formally requested. So sorry about that. I believe that your video is being transcribed, though, on YouTube, so hopefully that will help those of you that would need that type of thing. And I apologize about not knowing this before. I didn't know about it until someone mentioned it in class last time. Okay, so I don't think I'm going to go through the, kind of the course information. I think you all have that information multiple times. I don't want to waste more time on that. But are there any questions about the course or about the exams or anything like that that I did not present on those slides? So, if you are familiar with the slides, you know what's on there. But I can take a second to answer any questions you might have now about the course or the exam or any of the lecture material. I know you had your first discussion sections yesterday, and hopefully that was fun for you. Any questions on anything? No? Okay. All right, then I think we can continue talking about our history of perceptual psychology. Oh, somebody did raise their hand just now. Okay, go ahead, Mateo, is it?
So there's no assignments, it's just the exams?
That's correct. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye. Okay, so Yaneli did ask a question about the homunculus. I'll take a second and answer that. I won't have time to answer all the questions that you might have on the lectures, and your discussion section leaders will be able to help you with that. But the homunculus is just a very simple idea. Actually, I think that's the slide that we have up there. Hold on just a second. Let me just see something. Yeah. So let me go ahead and put our slide up because we're continuing to talk there anyway. And all right, there we are. Good. Some of you have very interesting Zoom images. Okay with me, but I just thought they were kind of interesting. Anyway, homunculus, right, okay. So the idea behind the homunculus is actually an important one, and it's an important one for theories of psychology, not just perceptual psychology, and I hope I emphasized that last time. The idea is this, that when you're talking about something like a mental representation, and in this case, the representation would be something taking the form of, say, the image on the back of the eye, somehow that image needs to be interpreted in order for it to be effective for the person, the animal, or whatever. And the question is, how does it get interpreted? So when you start talking about the interpreter of information, the interpreter of a mental representation like we're talking about now, you have to come up with an explanation for that interpreter that doesn't kind of just push the explanation deeper into the system. You have to come up with a very thorough and grounded explanation. You can't just say, oh, there's an interpretation done on the image by the brain and leave it there. You have to be very clear, because otherwise what you're doing is you're providing an explanation that really isn't an explanation. It just kind of uses an idea that's as sophisticated as the one you're trying to explain. So we're borrowing the idea, the concept of homunculus from the ancient Greeks, who thought there was some sort of agent in the mind or the brain that did an interpretation of this input image on the back of the eye. And that was an explanation, at least an initial one. And of course, the question becomes, well, how does that agent interpret? Okay, well, it's got to have some sort of interpreter system inside of it, right? And so what you're just doing is you're taking this explanation of interpretation and kind of pushing it deeper into the system. And so that's not really an explanation. That's kind of going through what we call a regress. And it could go on forever and ever and ever, where we really aren't explaining what's going on. Instead, we're assuming that the explanation lies at something deeper into the system. And it really isn't a sufficient explanation. It's just, we're kind of using an idea that we're trying to explain to begin with to then explain what we're doing, which is the idea of an agent, an interpreter, interpreting something, and then that interpreter needing an interpreter, and then that little interpreter needing an interpreter, and that's what's meant by this infinite regress. Now, these days, we don't talk about agents. We talk about processes, mental process, and computations and things like that. But we have to be very careful when we talk about those things to not just kind of leave them there. We have to get very, very thorough about what we mean about that and come up with some sort of very careful explanation. Otherwise, we are again committing this homunculus infinite regress problem. So how do we, we have mental representations in our minds, say, of our parents. There's a good one. That's a fun one. So, you can think about your parents right now. And the idea is that we have a mental representation. How are we able to experience that representation? And you say, well, there's an interpreter in our brain, in our mind, that's able to interpret that representation so we know what it is, right? Okay, is that a satisfying explanation? Well, not really. You're just saying you're using an interpreter to explain an interpretation. That's not really sufficient. And the same thing is true with the idea of process, right? Well, okay, so it's not just an interpreter, but there's a process that goes on in the interpretation. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you've got to be very, very thorough in explaining what that means, or you're just kind of pushing things back further and further. And this is going to be true. And this is what I mean by this kind of more far-reaching issue. This is going to be true when we talk not just about perceptual psychology, but any type of science that's going to involve mental representation, which is pretty much, if you think about it, all of psychology. So potentially this problem of the homunculus, right? It's not really an explanation. It's an infinite regress where you're kind of just pushing the explanation deeper into the system. That is a potential problem for all of psychology. And we'll talk about that later, but I kind of just wanted to lay the groundwork now. We will talk about the homunculus process later and before the exam, so you'll understand it more. But it's important to point it out here, okay? Especially as it relates to this idea that Descartes really wanted to make clear to us that we are not in touch with the world. We are not perceptually in touch with the world. What our, agent, what our nervous system and brain is in touch with, and therefore our perceptual experience, is how the body is being affected by the information in the outside world. So that's the idea of the doctrine of corporeal ideas. And I know that's a kind of fancy term. It just means corporeal means body, and ideas. You can, think about ideas as being any sort of experience we would have, any perceptual experience we would have, is based on how the body is affected, right? So our experience is really based on how the body is stimulated, whether it's by light to the eyes or sound to the ears or pressure on the skin. Our experience is based on how the body is affected by those different stimuli, which is important for Keanu Reeves, right, in the Matrix, because that's kind of the basis. So, we have no way of knowing if, in fact, there is an outside world. We are only aware of how our body is affected by stimulation. And that stimulation can come from something plugged into the back of our brains, right? That's the whole idea of the Matrix, right? There's no reality as people are experiencing it. right? The experience they're having is being determined by their brain being directly stimulated. And Descartes saying through this doctrine of corporeal ideas, yeah, that's all we can be experiencing is how the body is affected. Okay, we are experiencing the body's actions, the body's reactions potentially to an outside world, but it could be its reactions to a plug in the back of our heads, right? So we're only aware of the body states. To kind of help you understand this, I've got another kind of take on it, and it comes from, we'll give it a name first. Sorry about this. I typically like to talk about the idea and then give it a name, but the name's on the slide, the doctrine of specific nerve energies. And let me explain the slide and you'll then understand, and I'll help you understand what this doctrine means. The doctrine of specific nerve energies is something that comes from this is, by the way, we're intersecting very nicely with biology here, but it's something that comes from I think it was in a 19th century doctor, physician named Mueller. And he pointed out to us, based on his understanding of the doctrine of corporeal ideas, that Descartes had suggested that, yeah, if you think about how our experience works, it really is based on which nerves are stimulated. And in some ways, we might not even know how those nerves are stimulated, right? Which is kind of the matrix argument. But he gives a very nice example based on some experiments he was able, kind of very rough experiments he was able to do in his lab with some friends. And then he was also a surgeon, and he was able to kind of test out people during surgery. And it came out like this. So okay, so there's the eye. We'll be able to use that in just a second. We can have an experience of light from various means that the nerves back here, okay, the nerve as they're connected to the retina, is stimulated. In other words, you can stimulate back there a lot of different ways, and the same experience of light is going to occur. Right? So what's the easiest way of doing that? Well, you can, the most regular way that this nerve back here is stimulated is by light, right? So you can shine a light into the back of the eye, or, just as we've been talking about, light does get to the back of the eye, and that stimulates the cells back there that induce activity in that nerve, in the occipital nerve here. All right, that is the typical way it happens, but it's not the only way you can stimulate that nerve and induce an experience of light, right? You can also stimulate with electricity. And this is something, he was able to show through his, little mini experiments during surgery, where he was, working on doing surgery on people's visual systems, the eyes, and that sort of thing. He was able to, there's such patients would be awake, they'd be locally anesthetized. So I guess this is probably early 20th century, maybe, that they would stimulate the back of the eye with a little electrical stimulus, very light, and wouldn't be painful. They were anesthetized locally, but they could say, okay, what are you experiencing now? And they say, well, I'm actually seeing a light. It's not the sort of light that allows me to recognize objects, like I don't see chairs in front of me when you stimulate me like that. I kind of see a floating light, but yeah, it's a light. I definitely am experiencing light. So there's another way that you can stimulate that nerve and induce an experience of light in the person's whose eye it is. In other ways, chemicals. Maybe you've experienced this before. I don't know if they still use the same chemicals to dilate your pupils these days. It's been a while for me, but to dilate your pupils, when you go to the optometrist, they put eye drops in, and sometimes those eye drops can seep to the back of the eye and make contact with the retinal cells back there, I guess, and they can induce an experience of light. And there's many other ways of doing this as well. You can apply chemicals directly to the back of the eye and then ask somebody what they experienced, and they'll say, yeah, it's light. Again, it's a kind of a, floating amorphous light, but it's light, same type of thing. And you can even do it on your own right now if you want. You can apply pressure to the eye just from the, pushing on the eyelid. Maybe you've done this before. You've done it inadvertently by rubbing your eye a little too hard, or maybe, from a weird angle, and you see a little light kind of grow. And this, by the way, this is called just pressure phosphenes. You might have seen that term before, but basically they're an experience of light from actually applying pressure to the eye. So the way you can do it most easily is, yeah, it works for me. You can do this at home. You don't have to do it. I usually like to have people do this in class, but you don't have to do it in front of your friends. Okay, if I press the outside of my eye after closing it, I see a little ring of light kind of dancing around towards where my, the nose side of my eye. So I'm pushing on my right eye, and I'm kind of creating a little ring that moves around. Now, again, it's, what it looks like, actually. I just noticed this. I did install a little ring light here. Hopefully you're able to see me better, but it's like that little ring light is in my eyelid, under my eyelid, kind of moving around a little bit. When I push it up and down, I can see the ring going up and down. Yeah. Oh yeah. If you push it hard, you can see it pretty easily. It kind of moves around as you move your eye. It kind of moves in coordination with your finger, which is kind of cool. Now, again, yes, I know this is not like seeing things in front of you, like your desk and your I guess trees and everything, right? But it is still an experience of light, and that to Mueller's mind was a very important thing. What he's saying here is that yes, we are in touch with the body, as Descartes said, but when it comes to kind of the big classification to experiencing light, we don't know how that nerve has been stimulated. We experience that the nerve has been stimulated. We experience the activity of that nerve, which we experience as light. But we can get a light experience from many different types of stimulation to that nerve, and that's an important concept, right? So it kind of maybe even further separates us from the world when it comes to our perceptual experience, right? We are, yes, aware of body states. In this case, we're aware that the nerve has been stimulated, or where our experience is of the nerve being stimulated, but we don't know about what type of stimulation was used to induce that experience. So that's what's meant by the doctrine of specific nerve energies, right? We're just aware of, nerve cells being fired, right? We don't know what caused that firing. And that's completely consistent with the Descartes' doctrine of corporeal ideas and your friend Keanu Reeves, right? Where it seems that, again, as long as you're stimulating the right nerves back there with that little brain plug in the back of Keanu's head, he will not know what is stimulating it. Okay, he will not know whether it's electricity, which I bet maybe it is in the Matrix, or is it coming through light like it would in the real world, hopefully, right? Again, it's the idea that we have no way of knowing this thing. Our experience of perception is of the body, really. Okay, same idea, kind of more specific, kind of nicely specific here. Makes a lot of sense, and it's fun to play with your eyes sometimes. Okay, cool. Let's continue talking about this. And I'm going to now shift, though, a little bit and talk about kind of another issue with perception, one that is kind of aligned with this, that sometimes is more generally called the problem of perception. And I have problem in quotes here because there's many problems to solve in perception, of course, but this is sometimes called the deepest problem, or one of the deepest problems of perception. And as you'll see, it's related to this doctrine of corporeal ideas and the doctrine of specific nerve energies. The problem is basically, before I go through the rest of the slide, is that what we experience seems to be very different from any sort of stimulation we're ever given. And it seems to be richer, and it seems to be something that allows us to behave successfully, hopefully. But if you think about what is given on the various sensory systems, whether it's the eyes, the ears, the skin, etc., it's very different. So for example, okay, so there's kind of a rendering of what an image might look like on the back of an eye, right? It's, captured. So it's, you probably remember from, high school physiology or somewhere that the image is inverted, right? Because of the way the lens works. But there's an image. And we can call that kind of the image that first gives rise to sensations. Now, the way I'm going to describe that image is going to be even more rough and impoverished. It's going to be even more degraded. So this is what I mean. Our sensory experiences, and let me be clear what I mean about sensory experiences. These are considered to be like the basic building blocks of our perceptual experience, potentially. Okay, when you say what you perceive a chair, and potentially what the meaning of that chair is for us, as we've discussed. But you sense things that are much more low level. You sense light. You sense the presence of a light being on or not. You sense the presence of a sound there. Sensations are very low level experiences. Perceptions are, very sophisticated experiences of the world. So, books are called Sensation and Perception, and we'll talk about distinctions between sensation and perception. That's how I want you to understand it. That we sense when something, a very, very simple stimulus like a light is present, in a room, or a sound is present, in a room or something like that we're sitting in. But we're not able to recognize that light as being part of an object, or the sound as being something that is a recognizable sound, like a guitar sound or somebody talking. Sensations are just the initial potentially experiences of our awareness. Okay, the initial ones, not the sophisticated, complex ones. And what we're given at our sensory organs, the eye, for example, are very small, are very, very impoverished, as I said. They are certainly meaningless, right? So light comes into the eye and is then really just analyzed at a first sensory level by, cells, individual cells firing. There's nothing meaningful in what happens at that first stage, right? It's just these sorts of physiological events that happen at the back of the eye give us some sort of experience that there's stimulus present. That's it. Okay. What else? Well, it's distorted, and that's what I was trying to convey there with that image. It's inverted, but it's distorted in more ways than that. Because again, we're talking, and it kind of portrays this, not really. We're talking about, like a little screen on the back of our eye that's not really, continuous. It's got little cells. So really what we're getting is kind of a, the term pointillistic, it's used in painting sometimes, for people, style of painting where people are just dabbing the brush onto the screen. That's kind of what we're talking about in the back of the eye, that initial kind of image is inverted, it's pointillistic. So things aren't necessarily connected between those little points that the cells are responding. And at the very least, it's two-dimensional, right? It's completely two-dimensional. Yeah, the eye's curved, but there's no third dimension of space that is given to us at the back of the eye. Okay, so that's what we're first extracting. That's what the process is first abstracting, in that it is just a two-dimensional image that's inverted, it's reversed, it is pointillistic. It, in other words, is awful. That's what we're given. Our perceptual experience, though, the way we perceive the world, seems to be very rich. We perceive what's out in the world, right? We perceive the meaning of what's out in the world. we perceive, the meaning, so we know how to behave towards these things of what's out in the world. So somehow those really stinky sensations that we're given, okay, the really stinky kind of first images or first stimulation we're given, has to be made into something very rich and very meaningful. And that's what the processes of perception needs to solve. That's the problem that it needs to solve. How is that done? Okay, that's certainly what we're going to be discussing, over the next few weeks and pretty much through the entire quarter, right? How that's done. But this is kind of the heart of it. How, given our stinky beginnings of the stimuli, okay, very, very kind of degraded stimulus, okay, how are we able to get to an experience of the world, hopefully, that is rich enough for us to successfully interact with it? Okay, that's the problem of perception. Before we leave this, I just want to identify two more terms that are going to that we're going to be using throughout the quarter that is relevant right now. As you'll see, I'll be able to use these terms to kind of rephrase what we're talking about. Okay, there's all right. And basically what I'm going to talk about is the tree out here in the world and the tree image here that's on the back of the eye. And again, I mean, in some ways, this is a little deceiving. It's much more degraded than this. It's not three-dimensional. It's just a two-dimensional image on the back of the eye. And it's reversed and inverted. And it's, again, just pointillistic. It's completely distorted. It stinks, right? But we can actually give these two things names that are going to be useful. We'll call the stimulus out in the world the one that's distant from us, right? The trees that are in front of me, the grass and bushes that are in front of me right now. We'll call those things that are distant from us the distal stimulus. This is the distal stimulus. If you want to label your figure, that's the distal stimulus right here. And then the stimulus that's on the back of our eye, okay, the stimulus that's on the back of our eye, that's proximate to us, we're going to give the name the proximal stimulus. Okay. So again, just giving names here, nothing fancy, but it's going to be very useful, as you'll see in just a second. The stimulus out here in the world, the thing out in the world, is the distal stimulus. It's distant from us. The thing that's proximate to us, that's closer to us, is called the proximal stimulus, and that's right in this case in the eye. We're talking about, for sounds, it would be the stimulus inside that gets inside the ear and all that sort of stuff. Same with the skin. Okay. So armed with those terms, we can kind of rephrase this problem of perception. We are given the distal stimulus. That's what gets to our sensory. We are given the proximal stimulus at our sense organs, right? We are given this at the back of the eye, our proximal stimulus tree, right? But it's awful. What we behave towards is the distal stimulus, okay? That's the thing that we're going to have to avoid or pick apples from or hide out in if something's running after us or something like that, okay? So the question of the problem of perception can be recast as, how do we start with this crappy proximal stimulus and somehow get to the perception of a distal stimulus that's rich and meaningful and useful? Okay, it's another way of thinking of the problem of perception. The proximal stimulus is what's on our eye. It's awful. Somehow we're going to have to enhance it, embellish it, in order to arrive at a perceptual experience of the distal stimulus that, again, is meaningful and useful. That's what we're going to behave towards. Okay, so that's just another way of kind of phrasing this problem of perception. Okay, cool. Let's go on and talk about this. We're going to jump up in philosophy a little bit and talk about the British empiricists. This is 19th century stuff. And you probably learned a little about this somewhere along the way. I think usually intro psychology talks about this at one point or another. It's basically the nature-nurture question, but we're going to get a tiny bit more specific about it in this case, but it's not much more than that, right? This is, of course, going to be borrowing from the domain of philosophy, as we've been doing much of today and last class, and bringing in our one of the most famous British empiricists, and it's John Locke. There he is. As you'll see, philosophers tend to have better hair than psychologists, me included, for some reason. So John Locke, he could easily have been in a 70s rock band, don't you think? Yeah. Anyway, there he is. And as could Descartes, I thought had good 70s hair. Anyway, here's his idea. You probably remember this from other classes, that when it comes to our understanding of the world, both in terms of, the sophisticated stuff that we learn in school, but also importantly, the fundamentals, the perceptual understanding we have in the world, that has to come from some sort of experience that, say, an infant gains through the early years of life. Because according to John Locke, when we are born, okay, our mind, our brain for that matter, is born empty. It's born as an empty slate. That's the notion of tabula rasa. So if you haven't heard this term, it just means blank slate, I think, in Latin. I don't know Latin, but the idea is that when we are born, when it comes to understanding and interpreting the world outside us, we know nothing. Okay, we aren't able to do it. We are born with a blank slate. And I think he would say that then experience with the world writes itself on that slate being kind of like imagine a chalkboard. Okay, we're born with a blank chalkboard as a metaphor for our kind of ignorance about the world. And then experience writes itself on that chalkboard to help us then interpret the world. So there is an infant there in a little playpen or a crib, looking out at what is that, a mobile above it. And the question is, does that infant know that there are things on that mobile that are at different distances from it? Okay, is it able to have that understanding? And what Locke would say is, well, not when it's born. When it's born, it has to learn about distance perception. Okay? It has to learn that some things are closer than other things. And so he's saying just generally that our interpretation of the perceptual world, of things being at different distances even, comes through our experience. It's not something the infant can interpret right away. The infant, when it's first born, cannot know that some things are closer to it than others by looking. That ability has to kind of be trained through early perceptual learning. How does that happen? Well, this is what Locke thought, that when it comes to training our visual interpretation of the world, we gain that through touching the world. Okay, so even even the infant who doesn't move around too much is able to touch certain things, just in some ways inadvertently, right? They don't have a lot of control over their a lot of precision control over their limbs. They bump into things, but that helps immensely, he said. Okay, so depth perception, in other words, can come through our experience of touching the world, and then that experience will tell our visual systems how to interpret the world. Okay, so it's kind of a weird situation here, but how do you experience the 3 of diamonds as closer to the 2 of diamonds in this case? Well, you would say, if me as an adult is introspecting, I'd say, well, the 3 is occluding. It's covering up part of the 2 of diamonds. And what Locke would say is that's not something the baby knows when it's born. It has to learn to interpret that covering, that what's called superposition. Well, put that term up in just a second, but the 3 of diamonds is superposed over the 2 of diamonds, and that now as an adult we can, or even as a young child, we can interpret that as a cue to tell us that the 3 is closer than the 2. right? I mean, this happens all the time. You put your hand up in front of your screen and your hand is closer to you than your screen because the hand is covering up the screen, right? That's this superposed over the screen. We did not know that when we were born. When we were born, though, we did have experience touching the world. So, for example, there you go. There's that's babies probably even at that point probably has some visual interpretation. We're talking about very, very young infants, even if they kind of, randomly kind of touch things in the world, they do that. And as soon as they do, what Locke is saying is that then helps the visual system start interpreting the cues. So we can use this infant and say that the infant reaches out and grabs that little stuffed animal there. And there's things behind the stuffed animal, maybe other stuffed animals, maybe boxes or something like that. Because the infant has to reach less far for that stuffed animal than another stuffed animal that's behind it. He or she could then use that experience to then tell the visual system, oh, well, that little monkey, whatever it is closer to you. And now you can know this from looking because that image of the monkey is superposed over anything that's behind it. Okay, so touch then is kind of informing vision on how to interpret the world, right? So how do we know that superposition, right? Our visual experience that the 3 is closer than the 2 because the 3 is covering up, it's superposed on the 2. How do we experience with that as depth? And what Locke would say is, well, touch told us that. Touch told us that superposition, when we experience it visually, is a cue for depth. And from now on, or after at least a few experiences like that, we can now determine that when we see one object's image superposed on another object's image, then we can interpret that superposing image as being closer to us. 3 of diamonds is superposed on the 2 of diamonds, and therefore the 3 of diamonds is closer to us. I don't have to touch it anymore. I can just look, and boy, isn't that a good thing. Okay, so that would be kind of a classic sort of John Locke, kind of interpretation of how the tabula rasa then becomes, our tabula rasa of visual perception then becomes informed by our experience with touch, right? Maybe you're thinking, okay, well, maybe vision works that way, but all of perception can't work that way, according to John Locke, right? Because we're touching things. How come touch doesn't need to be educated, right? So if we're going to allow touch to educate vision, somehow, if we're completely blank slates when we're born, when it comes to perceptual experience, somehow touch has to be able to know something about distance. Okay, I'm touching my computer now, right? Know something about distance on its own without having been taught. I mean, is touch maybe taught by hearing, or is touch taught by taste or smell or something like that? So maybe, vision can be a tabula rasa, but is touch. And so, it's a little tricky here. The idea is that, when you push this kind of notion of a pure blank slate when we're born, you come into some problems pretty quickly, right? Maybe vision, our ability to interpret all the visual cues is in fact educated by our experience with touch when we're very young. But where is our experience of touch as something that can immediately tell us about depth come from? That can't be a blank slate, it would seem, right? Now it's, Locke had an explanation for that too, but it goes beyond the class. But if you're interested in that, it's something that you can look into, take a philosophy class or something like that. But it's important for us to realize that, especially one other thing I wanted to say about this. I think we consider ourselves kind of visually dominated species, don't we? I mean, we even have talked in our introductory lecture about this a little bit, that it seems that touch can override, I'm sorry, vision can override touch in some examples. So, you know, when we experience our Simpsons motion simulator rides at Universal Studios, right? Our touch system is telling us we're not moving very much, right? Touch being the general system having to do with our experience of how our body is moving, where it's positioned, all that. Vision overrides touch in that example and gives us an experience of motion that touch isn't actually being stimulated for. So vision ends up being pretty dominant, which is kind of odd given that it's something that's, according to John Locke, is being taught by touch. So there's some concerns right away with this sort of explanation, I think. But I wanted to make sure you understood that that is one way of thinking about how we can solve the problem of perception, that somehow the visual interpretation is taught to us by touch at a very young age, and that, you know, we'd have to get much more sophisticated in that to understand how, you know, the senses, the sensations we're getting from this image here can then be given or be interpreted as superposition and depth. But it's not sufficient. It's not satisfying. I think you agree, at least not with this portrayal of it that I just gave. Okay, we'll come back to this in a second, but I think we can take a little break here. Wait, what time is this? Yeah, let's take a break. It's a good place to take a break and maybe do, well, I'll answer some questions if you have any, but also do a practice question. All right, there's a little chat. Anything? Oh, that's fun. Okay. Yvette asked, could the movie Inception be used to understand perception, or do dreams fall under a different scope because it's dream subconscious, not real? Interesting. I'd have to think about that a little bit. Whether, I mean, you know, it really is about dream states, of course, but is there something perceptually relevant in there? That's a great question. Well, I'm glad you're thinking about things like that. I think it's really fun. There's tons of movies and TV shows that I think are really interesting with that regard. I don't know if you folks are fans of the Black Mirror series. That they deal a lot with perception, but there's some very good movies that deal with a lot of these philosophical questions. So good for you for thinking about that. I have to think about that a little bit. Nancy says, I see it. Oh, I think you're maybe talking about that little pressure phosphine thing. Like being blindfolded or having our eyes closed before we wake up in the morning and the sun streams into the room. Absolutely. So you're yes. So that is an experience probably of light. I think that when the sun streams through the eye, through your eyelids, that I guess that would probably be classified that light is still stimulating the optic nerve back there. But you're right. It is a very different type of stimulus of light, right? So it's interesting to think of it that way. Great questions. Thank you, Nancy. All right, anything else? Any other questions, or should we go into our practice exam question? Okay, let's do that. If you guys have questions afterwards, that's fine. All right, so this is a question that it comes from last lecture. It was, well, you'll remember, it was from the midpoint last lecture. You can look back in your notes if you want to, look back at the slides, whatever, or don't even answer it if you don't want to. I don't care. I think the important part is that we'll need to understand why the correct answer is correct, and you'll remember it for your exam. So let me read the question first. The notion that there is a replicated image of an object in the light, okay, in the light. Okay, so think about the tree and what the tree image, you know, that gets into the eye, the tree that gets into the eye. What I probably should have drawn in there was, if you, according to this idea, if you took a cross section of the light there would be a simulation of the tree in the light. That has a name. Is it the projective assumption, the replication assumption, the simulative assumption, or the Pythagoras assumption? Okay. We gave it a very specific name, and it's an important name because it's something that's going to play a role in more modern theories of perception. So I'll give you a minute to answer this question, and then we will talk about it. Again, this has no bearing on your grade. I have no idea who's answering in what way. Just a way for us to chat about it and for you to have a free question, lucky you. So exciting on my end. I get to see the questions that's winning. Right now, the correct question is winning. It's like watching a horse race. Okay, I'll give you about another 15 seconds. Okay, that should do it. So let me share the results with you. There we go. The correct answer is C, the simulative assumption. The projective assumption is related, but it is the part of the process which states that the image gets to the back of the eye. It is projected to the back of the eye. Okay, so that is separate. That we're talking about the image as it's in the light, that there's a simulation. B, replication assumption is just an incorrect answer. There's nothing, we didn't talk about any replication assumption. And the Pythagoras assumption is also different. I mean, it was maybe on the same slide, I can't remember, but it is part of what's discussed, but it's important that you know that it's the simulative assumption, where it's the simulation in the light that is going to be not only part of Pythagoras' theorem or theory, but also Democritus and most modern theories of perception are going to assume that there is something in the light that is similar to the stimulus in the world. Okay, and so the correct answer there is C. You'll know that for the exam. Hooray. Go ahead and take a quick screenshot if you haven't, because it's not going to be in your YouTube videos, as I understand it. Okay, terrific. So looks like there's a new question in chat. It is related to Democritus, absolutely. Yeah, and there's an element of it in Pythagoras too, but it's important you know the term more generally because it's going to absolutely be something we discuss when we get into more modern theories of perception. We're still doing history for the next few minutes at least. Okay, good. All right. Any other questions before we continue our lecture? Oh, that's nice. This looks like a fall scene back in the Northeast where I grew up. That's nice. Just going to enjoy it for a few minutes. Okay. All right, let's go back and share our screen and move on. And we're talking about these kind of big picture things here, and this is going to continue in that vein as we talk about kind of a more specific example of this. And this is called what I'm going to call Molyneux's problem. Now, as it turns out, Molyneux had a lot of problems. Molyneux was a 19th century physicist, I believe. And he had a lot of problems. I think maybe he was also a physician. Maybe he wasn't a physicist. I can't remember offhand. But anyway, he had a lot of problems. You know, he was a terrible driver. No, I'm kidding. One of his most well-known problems is something maybe you've thought of before, and is sometimes emerges in the news. And the idea is this: if somebody is born blind and then they regain their sight as an adult, are they able to interpret the perceptual world? That is one of Molyneux's many problems. And it's something I think people often think about. What does that mean? And we'll be talking about this later in the quarter, but some very interesting things have happened over the last 10, 15 years with regard to this question, because there are people who are born blind who can then be treated and made to see quite well, because the treatment just involves removing cataracts. So maybe you've had grandparents who've had cataract surgery, right? Cataracts is something, it's kind of a film that grows over the eye. With old age, I think we'll all probably, deal with this issue at one point or another. Makes things look kind of foggy, a little fuzzy, right? But it's a very straightforward surgery. You can remove them and people then see fine again, or as well as their eyes are working. They see they see clearly at least. And for a long time, there were people in rural countries, rural parts of countries that were unable to get this surgery just because the medical treatments weren't available to them, but given their distance from cities and that sort of thing. But then a group of physicians and scientists figured out a way of performing the surgery, with a very transportable system, and started to go to these remote part of the country. I think that in this particular case, this is India, remote parts of India, and give these individuals cataract surgery, very, very simple cataract surgery, so that in fact they gained their sight mostly in adulthood. These are people who've had cataracts since they were young, and really had no vision, so had very little, if any, experience of vision, and then had the cataracts removed, so then they were able to see. The question is, what were they able to perceive after they regained their sight? And that's a big Molyneux's question, and it's something that we can start to maybe understand an answer to based on this new, situation where people are having their vision restored for the first time in these rural parts of India that they weren't able to before. This is very, very recent, last 10 years or so. Anyway, that was his big problem. A more specific problem, besides his driving problem, he also has some hygiene problems, but that has nothing to do with this. I'm kidding. An example, maybe a more specific example of this issue of how we can interpret the perceptual world comes from this. The ambiguity of the light when it comes to the eye. So this is just an image I borrowed from a book. So ignore for now this B thing and imagine it's not there. Really what I'm going to be talking about is this big arrow A that's far away, and this smaller arrow C that's closer up to the eye. Okay, so imagine two things. You can talk about, arrows. People, imagine some of your friends built a big arrow that they put out in a football field far away, and then they build an arrow that looks just like it, but it's a mini version, and they've propped it up somehow so you can't see it being propped up, but it's closer. And here's the issue. Based on the distance of the big arrow, okay, it casts the same image onto the back of your eye as the smaller arrow that's closer up. So this big arrow A and this that's far away, and this little arrow C that's close up, both cast the image on the back of the eye that's the same, right? You know a little bit about intuitively how optics work. The further something is away, the smaller the image is going to be on the back of your eye. That's, I can just do this and experience that type of thing, right? Yeah, here's another example of this, right? Which doesn't seem to be much of a real world example unless you're talking about these folks right here. Hopefully you're recognizing them. But the issue is, how are we able to interpret this? Because we can interpret this. I mean, if in fact Dr. Evil is here and Mini-Me is here, they look very similar. We are able to tell that, oh, it's Mini-Me that's close up and Dr. Evil that's far away, even though they are casting a very similar, if not almost identical, retinal image on the back of my eye. Right? How are we able to interpret things? How come this is not ambiguous for us? Right? Because certainly, whether it was arrows in a football field or Dr. Evil and Mini-Me, we can do that. So how are we able to interpret the size of things and the distance of things, right? So let's talk about the size. How do we know that Dr. Evil is bigger than Mini-Me if in fact they're casting the same retinal image? Okay. Well, the idea that Molyneux came up with, and one that's, going to be kind of consistent with much modern perceptual thinking, is something like this: that our brains know, our cognitive processes know, however you want to pose it, doesn't matter to me. It knows these things, something about what's going on in the world when it gets this stimulus, gets the Mini-Me stimulus on the back of the eye, and it gets the Dr. Evil stimulus on the back of the eye. It knows these things. It knows, and tacitly just means it's unconscious and it's kind of reflexive, right? You're not thinking about these things. You're not consciously aware that your brain's going through these calculations. That's what tacitly means here. It's unconscious. It's automatic, right? First of all, it does know something about the objects in the world. It knows that people are typically more, grown-ups are typically more this size than they are this size, right? It knows something about the size of, can you see this? Soda cans, right? Oh, yeah, it's disappearing. Okay, that's fine. But hands are typically one size, that sort of thing. It does know something about the objects in the world. It has some experience about how big things should be based on what type of object it is. But maybe more importantly, it knows something about what happens to how images are cast on the back of the eye, depending on their distance. Let me just say that again. The brain knows something unconsciously, okay, automatically, about how big an image should be on the back of the eye based on how far away it is from us. We're going to give it a fancy name here, but it's basically what I just said. The brain knows something about the laws of projective geometry. The further something is away, the smaller the image is going to be cast on the eye, right? The further the trees are away, the smaller their image is going to be on my eye. The brain knows something about this, right? Whether it learned it through, John Locke's idea of touch or whatever, it's not really relevant now, but it does know this sort of thing. So that when we look at the world, we not only base our impressions of size on what's on the back of the eye, we also base it on this information about distance and these laws of projective geometry. In other words, we take into account what we can determine about distance when we're judging something's size. Okay, we take into account, the cues for distance when it comes to judging an object's size. How do we know mini-me is smaller than Dr. Evil, even though mini-me and Dr. Evil are casting the same image? Well, if they're casting the same image, then Dr. Evil has to be further away. And that is something that we are taking into account. So when we perceive size, and this is going to look fancy, but don't be scared of it. It's just a fancy way of conveying a very simple idea, I've already said. Our perception of size is a function of how big the image is of the object on our eye, along with its perceived distance. So that's what F means here. It's a function of. I put that on there because I put it on there like that, just so it could seem like we're being scientists today, right? I could have worn a white coat, but I decided to do it this way. Don't worry about this sort of thing. You'll never be asked to calculate anything. It's just a way of saying that the perceived size, our perceived size of something, the mini-me, Dr. Evil, a big and small arrow, your soda cans, hands, all that stuff, okay, is based on as a function of, F is a function of the retinal image, which is projected on the back of our eye by Dr. Evil and mini-me, and the perceived distance, which the brain takes into account when it comes to determining the size of something. Now, hopefully in your discussion sections yesterday, you learned a little bit more about this. I asked the TAs to discuss the moon illusion, which you're seeing there. And boy, California can sometimes be a great place to experience the moon illusion where, when the moon's on the horizon, it seems so much larger and more detailed than when the moon's high in the sky, even though in both cases, the image the moon casts on our eye is the same. It seems bigger when it's down here than when it's up here. Why is that the case? Well, it could very well be the case is because when we look at the moon and judge its size, we're not just taking into account the moon's image on our eye, we're taking into account the information for the moon's distance, which might be greater when it's on the horizon than up there. But your TAs hopefully took you through that to help you understand that sort of thing. But we can talk about this now, well-known illusion as being explained by Molyneux's principle here, his problem and his solution. And this title, The Inference Process, you'll see why I'm giving it this title. We're going to be talking about the idea, this is going to be important through much of our discussion in the first third of the quarter, that the process of perception is making good guesses, informed guesses, hopefully good, informed guesses about what's in the world. It's making inferences about what's in the world. So this is the process of that it might go through in doing this type of thing. So this is our first example of that type of thing. And this is a very well-known illusion. Yeah, gosh, I wish I had done this better. But we're talking about horizontal lines A here and horizontal lines B down here. And if I had done a better job with this illusion, A would seem bigger than B. Okay, I borrowed this one from a book. A here definitely looks bigger than B. The one on top, definitely, to me, I mean, there's no question. This line here looks like it's longer than this line here. And that's the famous Ponzo illusion. The question is, how does this work, right? Because, I measured them this morning. That's not true, but I did confirm that, yeah, if you just take out a little ruler, this line up here is exactly the same size as this line, but we don't perceive it as the same. That's the illusion, right? When our perceptual experience is different from the real world like this, we call it an illusion, especially when it's so striking and so such a simple sort of stimulus that's being misperceived, right? This is the Ponzo illusion. Why is that the case? What would Molyneux say about that? Well, he would say something like this. Pose with this problem to determine the relative sizes of A and B. What's taken into account? And so say, hey, somebody asked about the homunculus. Let's pretend you're the little homunculus that's in your brain. You're in the brain and you're a person. Okay, we're being kind of fanciful about this. You're a little person that's running around your brain, and your job is to determine which of these two lines, A or B, is longer. And you're lucky because you're equipped with certain things that are going to allow you to measure, and you're equipped with some information about how to interpret cues of distance. So the first thing you do as the little homunculus behind your eye is you get A and B. You're looking from the back of the retina, and you see A and B. The line on top is A, the line on bottom is B, right? And the first thing you want to determine is what their relative size is as they are projected onto the back of the eye. So you take out your little homunculus ruler. Okay, you're given one when you become a homunculus, and it's a tape measure. And you go, okay, the one on top is maybe a quarter of an inch on the back of the eye, and the one on the bottom's also a quarter of an inch. So, okay, I'll write that down in my little homunculus notebook that I'm also given when I become a homunculus. You're shrunken and put in the brain. That's how you become a homunculus. Okay, and so I can say that. So I will write down that the size of these two lines on the back of the eye is the same. And I'll use fancy terms. I'll say proximal size because I want to be a scientist homunculus. Proximal size A is the same as proximal size B. Good. Okay. So my homunculus, by the way, looks just like me, except much smaller, and is wearing a lab coat. And it's got all its tools in its front pocket. Okay. Cool. All right. Is there anything else I need to know? And I'm looking at the back of my eye here. Yeah, it looks like there is a cue for distance here. Okay. This one here. We'll use this one. And the cue here is telling me something about potentially the relative distance of A and B. This cue is a cue that tells me about distance based on what seems to be parallel lines that seem actually to converge, often in towards the top of the picture plane. Maybe you know this. This is a cue for distance. It's got a name, right? And I want to be a fancy pants homunculus scientist. So I'll say, yeah, there's a cue here that's kind of telling me that things up here in the world are further away from me than things that are here. And that cue is, in this case, linear perspective. It's a fancy term for the idea that, if you're portraying what seems to be parallel lines in the world, but when it's then kind of projected onto a flat plane, it seems like there's a kind of convergence of the parallel lines towards the top of the picture. it's telling me about distance. And linear, so that's linear perspective, that these lines look like they're converging towards the top of the image, and that point of convergence is further away from us than where it's diverged way down here. You know, it's just a fancy name, linear perspective. It's something that artists have used to portray, you know, relative distance in paintings since the Renaissance. You might know that if you've taken an art class, that they didn't use that sort of cue until around those times. But, you know, it's something that's intuitive. We could use lots of other cues, by the way. It doesn't look like superposition's too available here in this particular image, but the, you know, how, you know, kind of how coarse versus fine the texture looks, you know, maybe shading can tell us something about distance. I'm just choosing one that's very, very conspicuous in this particular example, with these parallel lines kind of converging in the distance. Linear perspective. So now I can come back and say, okay, I'm seeing linear perspective. So that means that the things towards the top of the retina's image, A, horizontal line A, is probably further away than the things that are in the bottom, which is horizontal line B. So it's probably the case that A is further than B out in the world. And I'm getting all that from the retinal image. I mean, I've had a, you know, this is kind of a, we know that it stinks, the retinal image, but, you know, this is the interpretation I'm able to give it because I'm a good little homunculus that takes good notes and does good measurement. And I remember from when I was a kid, linear perspective tells me about distance. I didn't, right? I had to learn that through touch. Okay, maybe. But I know that too. So that's clever. So I can now tell the body as the homunculus that, you know what? There's two lines out there, there's two bars, but I'll tell you something. They're not the same distance, but because they project the same image, it is in fact the case that A is bigger than B. That line on top is bigger, right? And, you know, because even though it's casting the same image, it's further away based on what we know of linear perspective, and other cues of distance as well. So I tell the body, hey, if you want the smaller of those bars, go for the closer one. If you want the bigger of those bars, go for the one that's on top, right? Top bottom. Go for A if you want the bigger bar, go for B if you want the smaller bar. Now, I was a serious little homunculus, right? I did my measuring. I did my, you know, incorporated the cues for distance and all that sort of stuff. But guess what? Now we know I'm wrong, right? I'm wrong in the sense that this is an illusion and there is no, this is an image that's being projected, a flat image that's being projected onto the eye and not an actual three-dimensional scene. That's kind of where I failed, is I didn't know that, right? Because there's an image on the eye. I didn't know it was actually a photograph. I evolved to interpret the real world scenes, not a photograph. And so it's kind of my fault that everyone's perceiving an illusion, because I'm kind of over interpreting what's going on here. And I'm assuming that A therefore must be bigger than B, but it's not. That's, you know, how it's my fault as the homunculus. It's my fault as the fallible process that, you know, the illusion occurs. Okay. Most importantly in this though, well, there's two things I want you to get before we leave this slide. One of them is that we are incorporating again the information about distance in interpreting relative size, just like we did when we were discussing Molyneux. Okay. And I'm making best guesses here, unconscious best guesses in terms of, you know, what you know, Rosenblum outside, the real Rosenblum is Rosenblum. My owner doesn't know anything about what I'm doing here, right? It's just, you know, conscious of grabbing the big one or the little one or whatever. But I'm making best guesses that are unconscious best guesses. I'm making inferences that are in fact unconscious inferences when it comes to, you know, our awareness. So my little Rosenblum back there, my little brain process, my little cognitive process, okay, is happening in an unconscious way as far as I'm concerned. Okay, big Rosenblum outside here is concerned. right? It's making guesses, and sometimes those guesses can be wrong, like when we experience an illusion. Okay, cool. So here's our last slide of this discussion, and it's going to be the first time we see what we could talk about as maybe a perceptual process. And I'm going to classify this as an unconscious inference-making process. And the way I'm going to portray this, if you're looking at the slide already, you'll know, but if not, I'm just going to portray this as what we sometimes call a flow chart, where we talk about different steps in a process. And I'll have boxes and arrows. This will be the simplest one you'll see, boxes and arrows that just go from left to right on your screen, just so you can anticipate where we're going here. So we're going to see many of these, and these are going to be really useful. These kind of flow charts are going to be really useful for us to distinguish the different theories of perception that we're going to be talking about. Okay, this flow chart is going to work like this. We're going to start off, and we will on all these flowcharts, with E being, we can actually talk about it in two ways. E could stand for the environment outside us, the real world environment outside us, or we can talk about it as the energy that comes to the receptors if we want to. Maybe it's easiest for us to talk about the environment. I don't think we'll have to interpret this as energy, but well, yeah, either way you can talk about it. But the energy or the environment is conveyed through light energy. It is conveyed through sound. It is conveyed through mechanical energy on our skin. And it will, in fact, come to the receptor surface of one of our senses. In the visual system, the receptor surface is the back of the eye. It's the retina and all its retinal cells. You know, if we're talking about the ear, the receptor surface is the cochlea, which we'll learn about later. It's just the inside of the ear, right? If you know, the receptor surface for this is the skin, if we're talking about touch. Talking about the eye though mostly, so we'll stick with the retina. Okay, and at that point, what's going to happen at the receptor surface is those cells are going to start responding and provide what we'll call sensations or sensory information to the process, to the perceptual process. So this kind of sensory information is extracted, but it is very, very low level. Remember when we talked about sensations before? Somebody asking a question, or I think maybe somebody turned on their mic by accident. It's okay. Unless you have a question. No? Okay. What we're doing here is we're extracting this kind of initial information of the perceptual process at the level of the retina. Okay. And then, you know, from that, we might be able to experience that there's a light present, or if we're talking about sound, that there's a sound present, but we're not able to perceive at that point. We're just aware that, you know, our eye is being stimulated, essentially. All right. From there, though, what happens is we make unconscious inferences, right? So it's actually our little homunculi, or probably more sophisticated, more modern, little processes of perception, cognitive processes, start to go through a process of making a guess about what's on the out in the world. Okay, and of course, as far as we're concerned, that's unconscious, right? You know, our everyday experience does not involve that, you know, awareness of the interpretation, right? It could never do that, right? We only have so much conscious energy to give to things, almost only so much awareness to give to things. And so we would not want that part of the process to be conscious by any means. But, oh, right. I'm sorry, I thought I put that in later, right? One thing that's going to help out with that unconscious inference part of the process is our memory of how to interpret cues, in this case for distance. So what I mean by adding memory to this is just, you know, adding, you know, our knowledge that we'll say is memory knowledge of how to interpret perceptual cues of distance, maybe in this case, in our example of the Ponzo illusion or the Molyneux problem, right? So that's all that's meant by memory here, that we have knowledge of how to interpret the cues in our memory system, and that's going to play a role in how we make our unconscious inference, how we go through the process. So this is, you know, basically this is, little Rosenblum homunculus is in there. He's, kind of got some initial sensation information by measuring, and now he's incorporating what he knows in his memory from about the cues for distance. And from that, we're ending up with our perceptual experience. So that's potentially where our awareness truly is. We're not aware of anything else before this, really. All this stuff is happening at an unconscious level, right? Including the guess of what's in the world. But then we arrive at our perceptual experience that, oh, this tree is closer than, or this tree is bigger than that one. This individual mini me is smaller than that one, Dr. Evil. Okay. So this is just another way of laying out everything we've been discussing in the last 15, 20 minutes. It's just a nice way of kind of portraying it, because we're going to see that other theories are going to differ in what these different stages are. So we'll be coming back to this sort of flow chart, this sort of, information processing chart for the other theories we're going to be talking about now. But this is just a kind of a very first portrayal of one of these flowcharts that I'm just labeling as an unconscious inference process because of this piece right here. Okay, let's take our break and do another question and answer your questions very quickly. Would you be able to talk about force perspective and how the homunculus works? It's going to be the exact, I don't have time to talk about that. That specific thing right now, but it would be the exact same way, Jenna. It's any sort of cue for distance is going to be part of the memory system that's going to be informing the best guess, the inference that's going to be established. Okay. Any other questions on this, or should we get to your polling question? Okay, let's do your polling question. We got time for one, don't we? Yes, absolutely. We have to go a tiny bit quicker, but okay. Let's do this one on the corporeal ideas idea. So I will read the question to you and then let you respond to it, and then we'll talk about it. The doctrine of corporeal ideas states that A, we are directly aware of the world around us. B, we are only aware of the states of the body. C, we are aware of the organized wholes of perception. And D, we are aware of global flow. Now, I need to stop here for a second. Some of the distractor answers, the incorrect answers, are actually taken from lectures I will be giving in the next week or so. So if you don't recognize one of these answers, right, it's likely because we haven't gone through them yet. So they're not right. Okay, you do know we have gone through the material for you to answer this question. So I apologize. I don't want to confuse you, but by the time your test comes, you'll know what those things are. Okay, here we go. Okay, I'll just give you another 10 seconds to make sure that we can finish the class. You're doing so well. Okay, that's fine. Keanu Reeves would be so proud of you. We are only aware of the states of the body. Corporeal means body. Corpse, remember it that way. Corporeal, corpse, body. The doctrine of corporeal ideas states that we are only aware of states of the body, not how those states of the body have come to be, what has stimulated the states of the body. Ultimately, that's how the matrix is able to work, because the people that are hooked up to the matrix don't know that they're not experiencing the world. They're only experiencing spotting states, and that can be simulated according to that movie. So the correct answer is B. Correct answer is B. Whoops. We are not directly aware of the world around us, according to this. And organized wholes and global flow are things we'll learn about later. Okay, have a good day. We will see you on Thursday, right? Yes. No, Tuesday. Have a good weekend.